So hello to whoever may be watching this. My name is Roland Russo III, and I am a junior English education major at Xavier University in Louisiana. And this is a presentation on existentialism and individualism in regards to Nathaniel Hawthorne, specifically his work, The Minister's Black Veil. All right, excuse me. So let's talk about Hawthorne himself, a little bit of background on him. So Hawthorne was an American fiction writer born in Salem, Massachusetts on July 4th, 1804. And he was a key figure in dark romanticism, and he delved into American Gothic. He was a very important figure for both of those literary movements. So Hawthorne has a Puritan background, being born in Salem. And something fun to notice that some of his relatives were actually involved as judges in the Salem witch trials that happened beforehand. And so while he never explicitly called himself a Puritan, he did hold some Puritan values and beliefs, but overall he was a critic of the Puritan culture and lifestyle and the way they viewed things. And this is told throughout multiple stories, such as The Minister's Black Veil, such as The Scarlet Letter, such as The Seven Houses. And another fun fact about him is that in an effort to distance himself from his Puritan family, he added a W to his name because, again, he didn't necessarily like the label of Puritan because he didn't necessarily agree with all that came with Puritanism. So let's talk about his life. So he believes he led an allegorical life. And this means that his works reflected his life, kind of like Shakespeare. All right, so from 1825 to 1837, after he graduated from college, he lived in his mother's Salem household. And growing up in Salem, it influenced his life a lot. It influenced his life very much so. He didn't have a father. His father died when he was young. And moving on and going fast forward a little bit, he actually broke his leg and he was immobilized. And that picked up and piqued his love for reading. So after that, he describes the state as like a dream-like isolation and solitude. And this is where he began his literary apprenticeship. This is where he began to really write and read and delve into all the nuances of literature. So let's talk about some characteristics of his writings. As I said before, he's a dark romanticist and he's a Puritan. And those themes can be seen throughout all his works. Here are just a couple key characteristics: obsessiveness versus open-mindedness, presumed guilt or innocence, hypocrisy versus candor, the penalties of isolation. Alienation is a particular one that's very important, and you will see it in every single one of his works. The belief in fate or free will, existentialism, and truth. All of these are very important motifs of Hawthorne. So here is my thesis for this project. Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Minister's Black Veil is an allegorical narrative about the existential crisis Hawthorne faced in the collectivist Puritan society that shunned things such as individualism. So here are some key terms to note. And all of these definitions are from the Oxford English Dictionary. We have collectivism, the socialistic theory of the collective ownership or control of all means of production, and especially of the land, by the whole community or state, i.e. the people collectively, for the benefit of the people as a whole. We have individualism, the habit of being independent and self-reliant, behavior characterized by the pursuit of one's own goals without reference to others, free and independent individual thought or action, and existentialism, a philosophical movement or approach which focuses on the analysis of human existence and on individual human beings as agents freely determining by their choice what they will become. Also sometimes applied to other philosophies, which lay particular stress on existence as distinct from essence. And these are all very important concepts that we will discuss in regards to this work. So, as said before, Hawthorne grew up in a Puritan household in a Puritan town. So he definitely had Puritan influences in his writing. So now Puritans have 5 core beliefs that they go by. One is total depravity. All humans are sinful, and humanity is irreversibly damaged because of original sin. Original sin being Adam and Eve eating the apple of knowledge from the tree. They also believe in election. God will save a select amount of people and is predetermined. You cannot be saved if God decided that he wasn't going to save you. There's nothing you can do about it. But the third belief is covenant. The people in God have an agreement that they will oblige to God's will and obey God, even if they aren't going to be selected to be saved. The next one is grace. The power and salvation of God is given. It is irresistible and not possible to resist God's will. Trying to resist God's will is trying to resist God himself, and that is physically not possible because God is all powerful and omnipotent. And the last is caritas, which is love. And these are the tight-knit communities in which the community interests come before the individuals. So this is early collectivism. This is the early collectivist mindset. And this is the basis for which collectivism will come upon. So let's talk about the city on the hill, because this is also a very, very important concept. This term was used by John Winthrop in his Amato Christian Charity speech in 1630. And this is the Puritan belief that their society is under constant scrutiny. And as a result, there to be role models for other societies and civilizations as well. There are role models of faith, community, government, etc., everything you can imagine. And this is something that's in his works, but reflected on a smaller scale. Instead of there being whole cities, one person is the city who is constantly scrutinized. So let's talk about dark romanticism for a bit. This is a branch of the transcendental movement and subgenre to romanticism, So it was influenced by it, but it's not a full embracing of its values and concepts. In fact, it's somewhat of the inverse. So here are some famous authors such as Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Dickinson, and Melville. And let's think about what all these works have in common. There's generally a dark tone to it, unlike transcendental works, which focuses on wisdom, divinity, how humans can become greater. Dark romanticism focuses on the opposite. It focuses on the inherent evil in all things. So here are some characteristics. It has a pessimistic tone. Individuals are more likely to engage in destruction and sin rather than wisdom and divinity. And nature is depicted as much more evil and sinister. Instead of positive revelations, the truth is often dark and hellish. So here's a synopsis of the Black Veil. So Mr. Hooper, who's a reverend, one day adopts a black veil in his appearance. Now, it's important to note that this is in a Puritan settlement. So the townspeople are mystified, and initially they don't know what's going on, and there's a lot of fear and stigma surrounding Mr. Hooper. And even his own wife cannot get Mr. Hooper to lift the veil. And the people start formulating ideas that, oh, maybe Mr. Hooper committed a sin like adultery or any other big sin that requires him to wear a veil because he can't deal with the shame of it. But eventually they come to accept the oddity of the veil and everything becomes normal. And it's also noted in the story that Mr. Hooper becomes a better preacher because of this. And more people start to relate to Mr. Hooper, and his congregation grows by people who feel like they wear a veil as well. And on his deathbed, they try to get him to remove the veil one last time. However, he protests and doesn't remove it. And his dying words indicate or show that everyone wears a veil, whether they know it or not. So here are some Puritan beliefs and symbolism in the minister's black veil. The veil, it can be symbolistic of hidden sin, individualism, and it can also be a biblical allegory. And the rejection of Mr. Hooper, there's irony in that. It has the Puritan beliefs of total depravity, and it shows that Puritan collectivism. So let's talk about the veil in more detail. So the veil has hidden sin and repentance. Now, there was talks about the veil, maybe Mr. Hooper, and the common theory is Mr. Hooper had an affair, and that's why he now wears the veil. But the townspeople kind of agree that Mr. Hooper must have committed some sin for the veil to be worn. And that's definitely one interpretation of it, and that's definitely the most common, especially because in the context of the story, this is a Puritan story. This is a story about Puritanism. Now, the veil can also be a representation of individuality. Okay, Mr. Hooper went against the collective mindset of the settlement and donned the veil. And people are afraid of the unknown and what they don't know. So that's why the people had such an adverse reaction to the veil, because it was something individual. It didn't benefit the people. It went against their beliefs. Mr. Hooper was being an individual, and now the people shun him. The people collectively shun him. And it can also be seen as a biblical allegory. The veil is equivalent to the crown of thorns Jesus wore. When Mr. Hooper donned the veil, he was essentially isolated and alienated from the rest of his town. And this is similar to Jesus when he had the crown of thorns on his head when he was carrying the cross. He was being ridiculed. He was being mocked. He had a huge burden on his shoulders, and he was alienated from the rest of the people, just like Mr. Hooper was. Another common theory is that it's very ironic, and we'll get into that. But the irony of rejecting Mr. Hooper, if everyone's a sinner, then why is Mr. Hooper being rejected for just admitting to his sins? Isn't that the common Puritan belief that everyone's sinners? So if Mr. Hooper sinned, why is a veil, which is representative of that, why is this causing such a big commotion? And the rejection of Mr. Hooper is symbolistic of total depravity, the idea that all humans are sinners, which is a common Puritan belief. And again, you can see that Puritan collectivism in his rejection. The town completely shuns him. They're afraid of him. But more and more people, more and more individuals who feel like they can relate to Mr. Hooper start to understand, start to go to his congregation more. And this, we'll get to this in the modern day implication section, but you can see how like those individuals on their own free will kind of aligned with Mr. Hooper, who was the first to do it, who was the first to say, hey, this is my existence, this is my truth. I'm going to do what I want to. And going against the community, you can see he was shunned, he was alienated, and more people felt that way as well. And that's how they formed that big congregation, that big group. And things like that still happen in real life. So the real life scenario of how this came about. So in the 1700s, there was an actual clergyman. His name was Mr. Joseph Modi. And he had like the same story. This scenario was actually inspiration for the minister's black veil. And the story goes that early in his life, he killed his friend, and he was never the same after that. And a couple of years later, his father wanted him to start preaching, so he did. Now, also later on, his wife and child died in childbirth. So he became really, really depressed. And from then on, he started wearing a veil on his head. It was actually a white handkerchief, but the point still stands. He felt alienated, depressed, and isolated from everyone else because of what happened. And so he hid his face. And that was the inspiration for the story. So, as we mentioned earlier, Hawthorne is very much a critic of Puritanism. He has Puritan roots and understands the concepts, and he even borrows some, but he's not Puritan. He's very critical of Puritanism as a whole. And this are shown in stories like the Scarlet Letter and the House of Seven Gables. The Scarlet Letter is about a woman who committed adultery and had a child out of wedlock with another man, while her husband was presumed lost at sea. And so she was ridiculed by the town, shunned by the town. However, there's a very ironic twist to it, because she accepted her fate and she accepted her sins, and all was fine and dandy with that. However, when the priest, aka the person who she committed adultery with, confessed his sins, he died. And that's the very ironic tone that comes with it. And that's the critique of the collectivist mindset, because you shun this woman, and when the other man, the priest, admits to his sins, it's kind of glanced over, not thought of as a big deal. The Puritan mindset is very, very collectivist and is very strong. Think back to the Salem witch trials. If you were thought to be a witch, you were burned at the stake. The trials were often very biased and based in the court of public opinion. And Hawthorne was very critical of that. And again, that's one reason why he changed his name, to try to distance himself from those relatives who were part of the trials. And the House of Seven Gables is a critique on his family ancestry as well. And as you know, they were involved with the trials, and their names slowly fell from prestige during the times before he was born. So there are a lot of modern day implications that comes with it. America is essentially founded upon Puritan beliefs. The city on the hill. America is supposed to be land of the free, land of the brave, such a great country. And there's a theme of collectivism that America was built upon. However, that's not always the case, and that doesn't always hold up. But the roots still remain. America is supposed to be a great country bonded together and founded on the ideas of brotherhood and sisterhood. Now, something else to know is that American individualism today has roots in theological Puritan individualism. In Puritan theology, each individual has a unique connection to God through his grace. And that's what makes each and every individual unique. American individualism, that's everybody can do what they want, how they want, because they are unique and they are their own individual. And these top concepts really tie into one overarching one, which is the individual versus society. You can see it with Hester in the Scarlet Letters. It was her versus her Puritan community because of her adultery. You can see it with Mr. Hooper, versus his community as a priest. He was shunned, isolated, both of them were. And again, alienation is a big theme in all of his works because, going back to what we said earlier, Hawthorne himself felt alienated and isolated from his community. Now, something known that his sister actually rebutted those claims and said he was a very social person. But during those times where he felt that dreamlike isolation, he describes, and at least he remembers it, as a time where he felt alienated and shunned from the rest of the world. But you can still see those ideas of individualism versus collectivism, the individual versus society, to this day. Americans fear the unknown. They fear what they don't know. Think of the border, for example. Half of Americans agree to have the border, half don't. The collectivist half that agrees, they're afraid of what comes from the opposite side of the border, individuals looking for a better life. That's one idea, and that's one modern day implication of the individual versus society. Another would be the Black Lives Matter group versus police brutality. So those are on two spectrums, correct? So it starts with one individual who's murdered by the police. And now it's the nation against the Black Lives Matter movement, against the judicial system, in order to let that justice ring upon. Those small little individual cases, they grow up and they become a collectivist as well. So now you just basically have a collective group versus a collective group, which again, you saw in the minister's Black Veil. Initially, the townspeople were confused and frightened by by Mr. Hooper donning the veil. But then his congregation grew bigger because all those individuals came together to sort of form their own little collective. So now it's like a collective ingrained in a collective. So these are some of the sources I used in order to get and make this presentation. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. This was a very, I'm gonna say unique, and it was very interesting project to do research on. Again, I have my sources listed throughout, so you can go and do some reading yourselves. This was really just glancing over what could be a deep rabbit hole you could fall into. But all of these topics are interconnected, like individualism, collectivism, Puritanism. They all have deep roots in American history, and they all are still prevalent today. And once you really get into like the spider's web, then you really will be on a very, very long journey. So I'm just gonna end